The promises that change your life are never the ones you make. They are the ones someone else keeps for you. I did not understand those words until the night I drove through the pouring rain toward Nathan Sullivan's estate with an old envelope resting on the passenger seat beside me. Every mile felt heavier than the last. The windshield wipers fought against the relentless storm, while the glowing skyline of New York faded behind sheets of rain. My hands tightened around the steering wheel as I replayed my father's final request for what felt like the 1,000th time. He had never asked me for much. He never cared about expensive gifts, perfect birthdays, or grand celebrations. But during the last week of his life, lying in a quiet hospital room where every machine seemed louder than the silence between us, he had looked directly into my eyes and whispered one promise I could never forget. When the time comes, take the envelope to Nathan Sullivan. Give it only to him. Do not open it. Do not let anyone else touch it. 6 months had passed since I buried him beneath the maple tree overlooking our hometown church. Yet the envelope had remained exactly where he left it, hidden inside a weathered cedar box beneath the floorboards of his study. Tonight was the first time I had held it in my hands. I still did not know why. I only knew I could no longer ignore the promise. The towering iron gates slowly opened before I even reached the call box. I never pressed a button. Nobody asked my name. Someone had already been expecting me. That realization sent a quiet chill through my chest as my sedan rolled along the curved stone driveway toward one of the most intimidating homes I had ever seen. The mansion rose above the rain like something carved from another century. Warm lights glowed behind enormous windows, while rows of ancient oak trees swayed gently beneath the storm. Every detail reflected quiet authority instead of loud luxury. I parked near the front entrance and stepped into the cold rain, clutching the envelope beneath my coat as though it were the only thing keeping me steady. Before I reached the door, it opened. A man wearing a perfectly tailored black suit greeted me with calm professionalism. "Miss Brooks?" he asked. I nodded once. "Mr. Sullivan has been waiting." Waiting. The word echoed through my mind as I followed him across polished marble floors reflecting soft golden light from crystal chandeliers above. The mansion was silent except for the distant sound of rain tapping against tall windows and the steady rhythm of an antique clock somewhere deeper inside the house. Expensive paintings lined the hallway, yet none of them held my attention for long. Every step carried me closer to a man whose name had become the center of every unanswered question my father left behind. We stopped before a pair of dark walnut doors. Without a word, the assistant opened them and quietly stepped aside. Nathan Sullivan stood beside floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the storm-covered city, his hands resting comfortably in the pockets of a charcoal suit that fit him with effortless precision. He looked younger than I expected, perhaps in his early 30s, with neatly combed dark hair and calm blue eyes that seemed capable of noticing every detail in the room without appearing to move at all. Confidence surrounded him so naturally that it felt less like a personality and more like gravity itself. He slowly turned toward me. Neither of us spoke for several long seconds. The silence became its own conversation. Finally, Nathan took a single step forward. "Olivia Brooks," he said evenly. "Your father left behind an obligation that belongs to me now." My heartbeat quickened, but I refused to lower my eyes. I had promised myself during the drive that fear would not speak before I did. Nathan studied me for another quiet moment before the faintest smile appeared across his face. "You are staying here tonight," he said with absolute certainty. "You are mine tonight." Every rumor I had ever heard about Nathan Sullivan rushed through my thoughts at once. Instead of arguing, running, or begging, I slowly reached beneath my coat and placed the weathered envelope between us. The cracked wax seal caught the warm light from the chandelier above. "Before you decide who belongs to you," I whispered, meeting his eyes without hesitation, "my father asked me to make sure you read this first." For several long seconds, Nathan did not touch the envelope. His eyes rested on the cracked wax seal as though it belonged to a memory he had spent years trying to forget. The rain continued to tap softly against the towering windows behind him, filling the silence with a quiet rhythm that somehow made every heartbeat inside my chest sound louder. I kept my hand extended, refusing to pull the envelope back. My father had trusted me with one responsibility. I intended to finish it. Nathan finally reached forward. His fingers brushed the edge of the paper with remarkable care before lifting it from my hands. There was no hesitation in his movements, only a strange kind of respect that did not match the man I had expected to meet. He turned the envelope over once, studying the faded seal beneath the warm light. "Where did you find this?" he asked quietly. I remembered the cedar box hidden beneath the floorboards, the smell of old wood filling my father's study, and the trembling in my hands when I first uncovered it. "My father left it for me," I answered. "He told me no one except you was supposed to read it." Nathan lowered his eyes to the envelope again. Then he knew this day would come. It was not a question. It sounded like someone admitting a truth he had avoided for far too long. Without another word, he carefully broke the fragile seal. The room remained completely silent except for the soft crackle of aging paper as he unfolded the first sheet. His expression stayed perfectly controlled through the opening lines, but then something changed. His shoulders stiffened almost imperceptibly. His breathing slowed. The confidence that had filled the room only moments earlier seemed to fade beneath the weight of whatever my father had written. Nathan turned the page and discovered an old black and white photograph tucked behind the letter. He lifted it carefully. Two young men stood outside a modest brick building with broad smiles that belonged to another lifetime. One of them was my father. The other was unmistakably Nathan, only much younger, dressed in worn blue jeans instead of a tailored suit. They looked less like business partners and more like brothers. Nathan stared at the photograph without speaking. "This picture disappeared over 20 years ago," he whispered. My pulse quickened. "You really knew him?" Nathan slowly nodded, never taking his eyes off the photograph. "Your father was the only man who ever convinced me that success meant more than money." Hearing those words felt strangely comforting. They sounded exactly like the lessons I had grown up hearing around our small kitchen table. Nathan carefully placed the photograph on the desk before unfolding the second page. His eyes moved across the handwriting more slowly this time. When he reached the final paragraph, he closed them briefly as though absorbing the full weight of every sentence. "Daniel," he murmured so quietly I almost missed it. "Why did you wait so long?" I stepped closer without thinking. "What did he say?" Nathan looked at me, and for the first time since I had entered the estate, I saw uncertainty instead of authority. He told me everything I believed about the past was incomplete. I frowned. "Then explain it to me." He gave a small shake of his head. "I cannot explain something I no longer understand myself." The answer surprised me more than any confession could have. The man whose reputation was built on certainty had just admitted doubt. He reached into the envelope once more and removed a small silver emblem wrapped inside a folded piece of cloth. The emblem caught the light as he opened it. It was shaped like a compass, with two engraved initials separated by a tiny star. N, S, and T, B. Nathan held it so gently that it seemed less like metal and more like a memory. "We each carried one," he said softly. I thought mine was the only one left. Before I could ask another question, his phone vibrated across the polished desk. He glanced at the screen, immediately declined the call, and slipped the phone into his pocket. It vibrated again only seconds later. This time he walked toward the rain-covered windows overlooking the front gate. His expression became thoughtful rather than alarmed. "Someone has been sitting outside the estate since before you arrived," he said quietly. I felt my stomach tighten. "Do you know who they are?" Nathan continued watching the distant headlights beyond the iron gates before answering in a voice barely louder than the falling rain. "No. But after reading your father's letter, I am beginning to believe they are not waiting for me anymore. They have been waiting for you." My eyes remained fixed on the rain-covered driveway long after Nathan stepped away from the window. The thought that strangers might have been watching me before I even knew why I had come here settled heavily inside my chest. Only a few hours earlier, I believed I was delivering an old envelope to fulfill my father's final request. Now it felt as though I had unknowingly stepped into a story that had begun decades before I was born. Nathan carefully folded my father's letter and placed it beside the faded photograph on the polished desk. Every movement carried quiet respect, as though he feared even the smallest careless gesture might disturb the memories hidden inside those pages. "Olivia," he said at last, his voice noticeably softer than before, "there is something your father never trusted paper to explain." I looked at him immediately. "Then tell me." Nathan rested one hand against the edge of the desk and lowered his eyes toward the silver compass lying beside the letter. 23 years ago, your father and I believed we could change entire neighborhoods without asking anyone for permission. We restored abandoned schools, funded community programs, and turned empty buildings into places where children could dream bigger than their circumstances. A faint smile crossed his face before fading again. Daniel always believed hope was a better investment than profit. I swallowed carefully. That sounds exactly like him. Nathan nodded once. It does. The room fell quiet again, filled only by the steady rhythm of rain striking the tall windows. Then why did he disappear? I asked. Nathan exhaled slowly, as though the answer still weighed on him after all these years. Because one day he walked away without giving me a chance to stop him. He left behind every project we started together and vanished before sunrise. I searched for him for months. Eventually someone convinced me he had chosen another path. I shook my head. He never stopped talking about unfinished promises. Even at the end, Nathan's expression changed. Regret replaced certainty. Then I spent 20 years believing the wrong story. He carefully picked up the silver compass and turned it over in his hand. The tiny engraved star between the initials reflected the warm light above us. We carried these everywhere, he said quietly. Daniel insisted they would remind us that the right direction mattered more than the fastest one. I looked at the compass more closely and noticed something I had missed before. The outer ring contained faint engraved numbers circling the edge. Those numbers, I whispered. Nathan leaned closer. They were not there before. We both studied the engraving in silence. It was not random. The numbers formed a sequence separated by tiny dots. Nathan walked toward an antique bookshelf standing beside the fireplace and removed an old leather-bound city atlas. He opened it across the desk and compared the engraved sequence to several faded reference pages before stopping abruptly. These are map coordinates, he said. My heartbeat quickened. Coordinates to what? Nathan traced the numbers one final time before looking directly into my eyes. A neighborhood library on the Lower East Side. I frowned. Why would my father hide coordinates inside a compass? Nathan smiled sadly. Because that library used to hold something we believed would change thousands of lives. Before I could ask another question, a discreet knock interrupted the silence. The assistant stepped into the office with unusual urgency, but remained composed. Sir, he said respectfully. Our security team reviewed the cameras outside the front gate. Nathan turned toward him. Did they identify the vehicle? The assistant nodded slowly. Not the driver, but they recovered something else. He placed a printed photograph on the desk. It showed the same dark sedan parked outside the estate earlier that evening. On the passenger side windshield rested a single white envelope positioned where it could easily be seen. Nathan picked up the photograph, studying it without speaking. Then his eyes settled on one detail that made the color drain from his face. The envelope carried the exact same cracked wax seal as the one Olivia had delivered only minutes before. Neither of us spoke for several seconds after the assistant quietly left the office. The printed photograph remained on the polished desk between us, its glossy surface reflecting the warm light from the chandelier above. I stared at the second envelope resting behind the windshield of the unfamiliar sedan. The cracked wax seal was unmistakable. My father had always made his seals by hand using an old brass stamp he inherited from my grandfather. I had watched him press melted wax onto birthday letters, holiday cards, and quiet notes he left on the kitchen table when I was growing up. I knew every tiny imperfection in that design. Nathan slowly picked up the photograph, studying it with a concentration that made the room feel even quieter. There should only have been one, he said almost to himself. My father never mentioned another envelope, I whispered. Nathan looked toward the letter already lying open beside the photograph of their younger years. Maybe because he wanted you to believe there was only one. I frowned. Why would he do that? Nathan rested the photograph beside the original envelope and folded his arms thoughtfully. Because if two envelopes existed, he expected one of them to fall into the wrong hands. His answer sent another chill through me. My father had not simply hidden documents. He had anticipated that someone might spend years searching for them. Nathan walked back toward the tall windows overlooking the rain-covered estate. The distant headlights beyond the gates had disappeared, leaving only reflections dancing across the wet pavement. The people outside were never watching my house, he said quietly. They were waiting to see which envelope reached me first. I tried to make sense of the thought. Then the one I brought. was the one Daniel trusted. Nathan turned back toward me, his expression calmer than before. The second envelope may have been intended to distract anyone who believed they understood his plan. I glanced again at the silver compass resting beside the city atlas. The engraved coordinates suddenly felt even more important. "The library," I said softly. Nathan nodded. "Everything keeps leading back there." He carefully unfolded the city map once more, tracing the marked location with one finger. Daniel and I spent nearly every Saturday at that building while Project Horizon was still just an idea. We organized donated books, helped students with homework, and planned scholarship programs after everyone else went home. A faint smile crossed his face. We believed small places could change big futures. I smiled despite the growing uncertainty surrounding us. That sounds like something my father would say. Nathan looked at me with quiet understanding. "It does." The antique clock in the hallway struck another hour, its deep chime echoing gently through the mansion. Nathan picked up the compass again and examined the engraved coordinates under the desk lamp. As he slowly rotated the outer ring, something unexpected happened. The center of the compass shifted with a soft metallic click, revealing a tiny folded strip of paper hidden beneath the face. We stared at it in complete silence. Nathan carefully unfolded the fragile note. Only one sentence appeared in my father's familiar handwriting. "If you found this before sunrise, go to the library before opening the second envelope. Trust the building before you trust the paper." Nathan looked up immediately. He knew another envelope would appear. I felt my pulse quicken. Then he also knew someone else would be searching for it. Nathan nodded once. Daniel was always 3 steps ahead. Without another word, he folded the tiny note, placed it safely inside his jacket pocket, and reached for his car keys. The uncertainty that had filled his eyes earlier had been replaced by quiet determination. He looked directly at me before speaking. "Olivia, whatever answers your father left behind are no longer inside this house. If we wait until morning, we may lose the only chance he spent 20 years preparing for." The rain had almost disappeared by the time we left the estate, but the streets still shimmered beneath thousands of reflections that turned Manhattan into a sea of moving light. Nathan drove in complete silence, one hand resting lightly on the steering wheel while the folded city map lay open between us. I kept the silver compass in my hands, occasionally running my thumb across the tiny engraved star that connected our initials with my father's hidden past. Every clue seemed carefully placed, not to confuse us, but to force us to earn the truth one step at a time. "Did my father ever tell you why he named it Project Horizon?" I asked quietly. Nathan kept his eyes on the road for a few moments before answering. "He once told me that no one could ever reach the horizon, but people still walked toward it because hope always lived just beyond what they could see." I smiled despite everything that had happened. "That sounds exactly like him." Nathan returned the smile, though only briefly. He believed every child deserved a future larger than the neighborhood where they were born. Project Horizon was never about buildings. It was about possibilities. 25 minutes later, we turned onto a narrow street lined with aging brick storefronts and towering maple trees whose wet leaves glistened beneath the streetlights. At the end of the block stood the old neighborhood library. Time had weathered its stone walls, yet quiet dignity still surrounded the building. Large construction fences bordered one side of the property, and bright orange notices announced that demolition would begin the following morning. My heart sank. We had arrived only hours before everything might have been erased forever. An elderly caretaker opened the heavy wooden front door before we even reached it. His silver hair framed a kind face that seemed immediately familiar, although I knew we had never met. His eyes settled on the compass in my hands before he looked directly at me. "You must be Olivia," he said gently. I nodded in surprise. "You knew my father?" His smile carried both warmth and sadness. Daniel visited every year. Even after his health declined, he always found the strength to walk through these doors. Nathan stepped forward and shook the man's hand. "It has been a long time, Mr. Ellis." The caretaker smiled. "Too long, Nathan." He quietly locked the front entrance behind us and guided us through rows of aging bookshelves where the scent of cedar, paper, and polished oak filled the air. The library felt untouched by modern life. Every shelf seemed to preserve not only books, but memories. We descended a narrow staircase leading into the basement archives where rows of small brass storage lockers lined the stone walls. Nathan unfolded the map once more before pointing toward the final corner of the room. Locker 7. The brass key hidden inside my father's envelope fit the lock perfectly. I hesitated, suddenly aware that this simple turn of my hand might answer questions I had carried for half a year. Nathan stood beside me, but did not interfere. "Your father trusted you to open it," he said softly. "That should still be your choice." I took a slow breath and turned the key. A gentle click echoed through the quiet basement. The locker door opened smoothly, revealing a weathered canvas satchel wrapped inside protective linen. There were no valuables, no stacks of cash, and nothing that resembled the fortune people might expect after 20 years of secrecy. Instead, I found carefully organized folders filled with architectural drawings, scholarship proposals, restoration plans for schools and libraries, handwritten journals, and photographs documenting smiling families standing outside community centers my father and Nathan had once dreamed of building together. Resting neatly on top of everything was another sealed envelope bearing my father's unmistakable handwriting. Across the front he had written only one sentence: "The future was never hidden. It was protected until the right people arrived together." For several minutes, neither of us touched the final envelope. It rested quietly on top of the carefully organized folders, as though my father still expected us to slow down before taking the next step. Around us, the basement archive remained perfectly still. The scent of old paper, cedar shelves, and cool stone filled the air, while a single hanging light cast a warm circle across the work table. It felt less like a forgotten storage room, and more like a place where time had patiently waited for the right people to arrive. Nathan carefully lifted the canvas satchel onto the table and began looking through the documents beneath the envelope. Every folder contained detailed architectural drawings, handwritten budgets, scholarship applications, and photographs of neighborhoods that had gradually transformed over the years. Schools that once stood abandoned now appeared filled with students. Empty buildings had become libraries, community centers, and classrooms. My father had never spoken about any of it. He had quietly allowed the work to matter more than his name. "Project Horizon was real," I whispered. Nathan nodded slowly. "It was always real. Most people simply never knew who built it." He carefully opened one of the leather journals resting beneath the folders. The first page contained my father's familiar handwriting. There were no dramatic confessions, only careful notes about families who needed assistance, renovation schedules, scholarship recipients, and reminders to call volunteers who had donated their weekends. Every page reflected the same simple belief: communities become stronger when people quietly help one another. Nathan turned another page before stopping suddenly. A folded index card slipped onto the table. He picked it up and smiled with quiet recognition. Daniel never changed. I looked closer. The card contained nothing except a short handwritten list. Read, learn, serve, repeat. I laughed softly despite the emotion building inside me. He used to tape that exact sentence above my desk every school year. Nathan looked at me with genuine warmth. He kept one above his own desk too. For the first time all evening, our conversation felt less like strangers searching through history and more like two people remembering the same person from different chapters of his life. Nathan continued reading until another document caught his attention. It was an official filing certificate bearing the title Project Horizon Educational Initiative. Attached to it was a notarized amendment transferring oversight into something called the Brooks Community Trust. I frowned. That is my family name. Nathan carefully studied the signatures before looking back at me. Your father prepared this years ago. Why would he never tell me? Nathan closed the folder gently. Because he never wanted you to inherit responsibility before you were ready to choose it yourself. His answer settled quietly inside me. My father had never tried to shape my future through pressure. Instead, he had simply trusted that one day I would discover it on my own. Just then, Mr. Ellis returned carrying a small wooden tray with 3 steaming cups of coffee. He placed them on the table before smiling toward the journal. Daniel always stayed late whenever he worked down here, he said. He believed every good plan deserved fresh coffee. Nathan smiled for the first time without sadness. Some traditions should never disappear. As we quietly shared the warm coffee, Mr. Ellis glanced toward the final sealed envelope still resting untouched on the satchel. He gave me very specific instructions about that one, the caretaker said. Nathan looked up. What kind of instructions? Mr. Ellis folded his hands calmly. He said no one should open it until someone named Samuel Whitaker had been contacted. I exchanged a surprised glance with Nathan. Who is Samuel Whitaker? Mr. Ellis answered without hesitation. Your father's attorney and closest advisor during the final years of Project Horizon. Nathan slowly nodded as though another missing piece had finally fallen into place. Before either of us could ask another question, the quiet ringing of my cell phone echoed through the basement archive. The number displayed on the screen was unfamiliar, but something inside me insisted I answer. An older gentleman spoke with calm confidence before I could even introduce myself. Miss Brooks, my name is Samuel Whitaker. Daniel asked me to call you the moment Locker 7 was opened. If you have found the final envelope, then there is something both you and Nathan Sullivan need to see before sunrise. Samuel Whitaker asked us to meet him at a quiet law office overlooking Bryant Park, and less than 45 minutes later Nathan and I stepped into a conference room where every detail reflected patience instead of urgency. Shelves filled with leather-bound legal volumes lined the walls. Soft brass lamps cast warm pools of light across polished oak furniture, and the distant sounds of the city seemed unable to disturb the calm inside the room. An elderly gentleman rose from his chair the moment we entered. His silver hair was neatly combed, his dark blue suit perfectly pressed, and his steady gray eyes rested first on the canvas satchel in my hands before meeting mine with unmistakable kindness. Olivia Brooks, he said gently. Your father spoke about this evening for many years. I swallowed carefully. You knew he believed this day would happen? Samuel smiled with quiet certainty. Daniel rarely confused hope with coincidence. If he prepared something, he trusted it would eventually reach the right people. Nathan stepped forward and shook his hand warmly. There was no formal introduction necessary. They greeted each other with the respect shared by two men connected through decades of loyalty. Samuel motioned for us to sit before placing a large cream-colored document envelope onto the conference table. Unlike every other envelope we had discovered, this one carried the embossed seal of his law firm alongside my father's unmistakable signature across the front. Samuel rested both hands gently upon it. Daniel instructed me to keep this sealed until 3 conditions were fulfilled, he explained. First, Olivia had to deliver the original letter to Nathan without opening it herself. Second, Locker 7 had to be recovered before the library disappeared. Third, both of you had to remain together throughout the journey. Nathan leaned forward slightly. Why was that last condition so important? Samuel looked from Nathan to me before answering. Because Daniel believed neither of you would ever understand the full truth alone. Those words settled quietly over the room. Every hidden clue suddenly felt connected. The compass, the library, Project Horizon, the journals. None of them had been designed for one person to solve. Samuel carefully opened the envelope and removed a thick legal binder secured by a navy ribbon. Across the cover appeared a title that immediately caught my attention. Brooks Community Trust. My heartbeat quickened. Nathan slowly read the words beside me. Samuel untied the ribbon and opened the first page. Daniel established this charitable trust more than 20 years ago, he explained. However, he delayed its public activation until tonight. He turned several pages before gently rotating the binder toward us. 2 names appeared beneath the section titled Successor Trustees. The first was Olivia Brooks. The second was Nathan Sullivan. I looked toward Nathan in complete surprise. His expression mirrored my own. Samuel nodded softly. Daniel believed the mission would only survive if both of you accepted it together. Nathan remained silent for several moments before quietly asking, everything he built, he trusted us to continue it? Samuel smiled. Not because you are perfect, because he believed both of you understood something more valuable than success. Responsibility. He reached into his briefcase one final time and removed a framed photograph neither of us had seen before. It showed my father and Nathan standing outside a newly renovated neighborhood learning center, surrounded by smiling children holding books above their heads. Across the bottom border, my father had written a short message in blue ink. The strongest legacy is not remembered because it is celebrated. It is remembered because someone chooses to continue it. I felt my eyes fill with tears as I traced the familiar handwriting. My father had never wanted recognition. He had wanted continuity. Samuel carefully placed the photograph beside the binder before speaking again. Tomorrow evening, the Sullivan Foundation hosts its annual education gala. Daniel requested that the Brooks Community Trust be introduced there for the very first time, not as a memorial to the past, but as an investment in the future. Nathan slowly turned toward me. The confidence that had once demanded obedience had transformed into something entirely different. "Olivia," he said quietly, "your father spent 20 years preparing this moment. Whatever happens tomorrow belongs to your decision, and I will stand beside whatever choice you make." The following evening arrived with clear skies, as though the city itself had decided to welcome a new beginning. As Nathan's car pulled beneath the illuminated entrance of the Sullivan Foundation, I looked through the window at the grand ballroom where hundreds of guests had already gathered beneath sparkling crystal chandeliers. Educators, business leaders, volunteers, scholarship recipients, and community organizers filled the room with warm conversations that sounded nothing like the intimidating world I had imagined when I first drove through the gates of Nathan's estate less than 2 days earlier. Everything had changed. I stepped out of the car holding the leather binder and the silver compass inside my handbag, reminding myself that my father had never wanted attention. He had only wanted the work to continue. Nathan walked beside me instead of leading the way, matching his pace to mine without saying a word. That simple gesture told me more than any promise could have. The man who had once believed authority solved every problem now understood that respect began by walking beside someone instead of ahead of them. Samuel Whitaker greeted us just inside the entrance with a warm smile. "Everything is ready," he said quietly. "Your father would have been proud of this evening." I felt a familiar ache in my chest, but it was no longer the ache of grief. It had become gratitude. As the evening program began, Nathan stepped onto the stage before a room filled with quiet anticipation. He welcomed everyone with calm confidence, thanked the volunteers and educators who had dedicated their lives to helping others, and then paused for several thoughtful seconds. The ballroom grew completely silent. "Every city," he began, "is remembered by its buildings, but it is shaped by the people who quietly believe tomorrow can be better than today." He looked toward me before continuing. "Tonight we honor someone whose greatest achievements were never measured by recognition, but by the opportunities he created for families he would never personally meet." Samuel joined him on the stage carrying the leather binder while I slowly walked forward, my heartbeat echoing louder than the applause that welcomed me. Samuel carefully opened the official documents establishing the Brooks Community Trust and explained how one man's quiet vision had supported neighborhood libraries, educational centers, scholarships, literacy programs, and community partnerships for more than 20 years without ever seeking public acknowledgement. There were no dramatic revelations, no accusations, no public conflict, only the quiet restoration of truth. Nathan then lifted the framed photograph showing him and my father standing beside a newly completed learning center surrounded by smiling children. He smiled softly before speaking again. "Thomas Brooks taught me that lasting success is measured by the number of lives improved after your name is forgotten." Hearing my father's name spoken with such sincere respect filled my eyes with tears. Around the ballroom, guests listened with complete attention. Several educators quietly nodded as Samuel described programs that had shaped their own schools years earlier without them ever knowing who had first imagined them. One scholarship recipient stood to thank the anonymous donors who had made college possible. Another community leader shared how an abandoned building had become a neighborhood learning center because someone believed children deserved more choices. Story after story revealed that Project Horizon had never disappeared. It had simply continued under different names through ordinary people willing to keep serving others. When the presentation concluded, warm applause gradually spread through the ballroom until every guest had risen to their feet. Nathan looked toward me with quiet pride rather than accomplishment. He had not claimed my father's legacy. He had protected it until it could return to its rightful purpose. As the guests gathered around to offer their support, Samuel placed one final sealed envelope into my hands. "Daniel asked me to give you this only after the trust officially became public," he said gently. I looked down at my father's familiar handwriting across the front. "For Olivia. Open only after hope has been shared." I carefully held the envelope against my heart, realizing there was only one final message left to hear before the remarkable journey my father had quietly begun decades earlier could finally become complete. As the last guest slowly departed, The grand ballroom settled into a peaceful silence that felt completely different from the silence I had walked into less than 2 days earlier. Back then, silence carried uncertainty. Now it carried fulfillment. The crystal chandeliers still reflected warm light across the polished floor, while staff quietly gathered programs and flowers from the evening celebration. Nathan stood beside the tall windows overlooking the Manhattan skyline, his hands resting comfortably in his pockets as the city lights shimmered beyond the glass. I looked down at the final envelope my father had left behind. The familiar handwriting across the front seemed almost alive beneath my fingertips. I carefully broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet inside. There were no complicated instructions, no hidden maps, and no final mystery waiting to be solved. Instead, my father's steady handwriting filled only one page. Olivia, if you are reading this, then everything happened exactly as I hoped. You met the man I believed would one day remember that real strength is measured by what we protect, not by what we control. If Nathan is standing beside you now, then both of you have already discovered the greatest secret I could leave behind. Dreams do not survive because one person is extraordinary. They survive because ordinary people continue them together. I paused as emotion tightened my throat. Every letter my father had hidden, every photograph, every compass, every quiet clue suddenly became clear. He had never created a puzzle simply to test us. He had created a path that slowly transformed two strangers into partners who trusted one another enough to carry the future together. I continued reading. Never allow success to become louder than kindness. Never allow power to become greater than compassion. The buildings you restore will eventually grow old. The names engraved upon them will eventually fade. But every child who discovers hope inside those walls will carry your work farther than either of you can imagine. That is the only legacy worth leaving. I lowered the letter slowly, unable to speak for several moments. Nathan remained quietly beside me, giving me the space to absorb every word without interruption. When I finally looked toward him, I saw the same calm sincerity that had slowly replaced the certainty I encountered on the night we first met. He smiled gently. Your father always knew how to say the important things with very few words. I nodded. He trusted you long before I ever understood why. Nathan looked toward the skyline before answering. I spent years believing he abandoned our dream. Tonight, I finally understand that he was protecting it until the right time. We stood together in comfortable silence while the last lights across the ballroom gradually dimmed. There was nothing left to solve because the answers had never been hidden inside envelopes alone. They had been hidden inside choices. My father chose hope over recognition. Nathan chose responsibility over control. And somewhere along the way, I had chosen to keep a promise without realizing it would become the beginning of an entirely new life. Before we walked toward the exit, Nathan reached into his jacket pocket and placed the silver compass into my hand. I looked at him in surprise. He gently closed my fingers around it. Your father once told me a compass belongs to the person still willing to keep walking, he said quietly. I think he always intended for it to become yours. I smiled through the tears gathering in my eyes. Together we stepped outside into the cool evening air where the storm had completely disappeared, leaving the streets clean beneath a sky filled with quiet stars. The city looked exactly the same as it had 2 nights earlier, yet everything inside me had changed. I had arrived believing I was delivering the final chapter of my father's story. Instead, I discovered he had been writing the first chapter of mine all along. As Nathan and I walked side by side toward the waiting car, I realized the greatest promises are never spoken beneath bright lights or celebrated before crowded rooms. They are quietly kept, one thoughtful decision at a time, until hope becomes someone else's beginning. And that is how an ordinary promise can change not only one life, but every tomorrow that follows.